The last drops of water hit my tongue like a taunt. I shook the aluminum bottle, listening to the hollow echo that confirmed what my parched throat already knew. Empty. 2 days into what should have been a comfortable 3-day circuit through the Blue Mountains, and my water was gone. I'd been rationing since yesterday morning, when the first tendrils of doubt crept in. The trail markers had grown sparse, then disappeared altogether somewhere near that rocky outcrop where I'd stopped to photograph the valley view. Now, standing in dappled sunlight that filtered through the eucalyptus canopy, I felt the weight of my mistake settling like sediment in my gut. The GPS unit clipped to my pack had been flashing the same useless message for hours. Signal lost. Above me, the interlaced branches formed a green ceiling so dense that even at midday the light felt dim and strange. My mouth tasted of copper and regret. I'd been hiking these mountains for 15 years, ever since my father first brought me up here as a teenager. I knew the difference between a game track and a walking trail. I could read contour lines like scripture. I'd never spent a night outdoors I hadn't planned for. But somewhere in my confidence, somewhere in the familiar rhythm of boot against earth, I'd stopped paying attention. The trail had narrowed, then forked, then become something else entirely while my mind wandered to work deadlines and the argument I'd had with Sarah before leaving. She'd been picking at me about taking these solo trips, about needing to prove something to myself. "You're not 20 anymore, Jack," she'd said as I loaded my pack into the ute. "Maybe it's time to start hiking with other people instead of running off into the bush every time something bothers you." I'd kissed her goodbye and promised to be careful, but we both knew I wasn't really listening. The mountains had always been my escape, my way of clearing my head when the world got too complicated. My father had understood that. He'd taught me that the bush could teach you things about yourself that no city experience could match. What he hadn't taught me was how quickly that same bush could turn from teacher to executioner. Now the forest pressed close around me, alien despite my years of experience. The trees all looked the same, pale trunks rising into a confusion of branches, their bark peeling like old paint. I'd been walking for 3 hours since realizing I was truly lost, following what might have been a deer path, or might have been nothing at all. My pack, which had felt reassuringly heavy at the trailhead, now seemed pathetically inadequate. 2 energy bars, a handful of trail mix, a water purification tablet I'd never actually used. I remember packing that morning, Sarah still asleep in bed while I moved quietly around the kitchen. Coffee that tasted like ambition, sandwiches wrapped in foil, the familiar ritual of checking gear, consulting maps, calculating water needs. I'd been so confident, so certain I knew this country. The trailhead had been busy with families preparing for day walks, kids excited about their first real bushwalk. I'd felt slightly superior to them with their oversized packs and nervous questions about drop bears. I was the experienced one, the bloke who could disappear into the high country for days and emerge with stories and photographs. Now those families with their careful preparations and detailed plans seemed infinitely wiser than me. The sun, when I could glimpse it through the canopy, told me it was well past noon. I'd planned to be back at my car by now, driving down the mountain with another successful solo trip behind me. Instead, my tongue felt thick and my head had begun the faint throb that meant dehydration was setting in. I forced myself to stop and think. Panic was a luxury I couldn't afford. I pulled out my topographical map and spread it across a fallen log, trying to correlate the contour lines with the landscape around me. But every ridge looked like every other ridge, every gully a mirror of the last. Without knowing where I'd left the main trail, the map was just colored paper. My father's voice came back to me from years ago, patient and instructive. "If you ever get turned around, Jack, the first thing you do is stop moving. Sit down, have a drink, think about what you know for certain." What I knew for certain wasn't much. I'd left the main track, somewhere near Narrow Neck Plateau. The rocky outcrop where I'd taken photos had faced east, looking out over the Jameson Valley. But there were dozens of such outcrops, hundreds of possible places where an inattentive hiker could wander off the beaten path. The silence of the high country was different from the quiet of lower elevations. It had weight to it, a presence that made me conscious of my breathing. Occasionally a bird called from somewhere invisible in the canopy, but the sound only emphasized how alone I was. I'd always prided myself on being comfortable with solitude, but this wasn't solitude. This was isolation with teeth. I folded the map carefully and shouldered my pack. Moving was better than standing still, and somewhere in this maze of trees and ridgelines, there had to be water. In country like this, there was always water if you knew how to find it. My father had taught me that much. The afternoon stretched on as I picked my way through increasingly rugged terrain. I'd given up following anything that resembled a path, and instead focused on reading the landscape for signs of drainage. Water carved the mountains into their present form, and water would be my salvation if I could find it. Every slight depression in the earth earned my attention. Every change in vegetation might signal the presence of moisture. I thought about the morning I'd left, trying to remember every detail that might help me navigate back. Sarah making coffee in the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep. The argument we'd had the night before about my very job, about whether I was running away from problems instead of solving them. She'd been right about some of it, but I wasn't ready to admit that yet. The mountains had always been where I came to think, where my father had brought me, when I needed to understand something about myself or the world. After he died 6 months ago, these solo trips had become more frequent, more necessary. I was trying to maintain some connection to the man who'd shaped me, trying to honor the lessons he'd taught me about reading the country and respecting its power. Instead, I was proving that I'd learned nothing at all. My legs had begun to feel unsteady by the time I heard it, the faintest whisper of water over stone. I stopped, holding my breath, afraid the sound might be my imagination. But there it was again, the unmistakable murmur of a creek somewhere ahead through the trees. I crashed through the undergrowth with more enthusiasm than caution, branches catching at my pack and face. The sound grew stronger, more certain, until I pushed through a curtain of ferns and found myself on the bank of a narrow creek that tumbled over moss-covered rocks in a series of small cascades. I stared at the water for a long moment. It looked clean enough, clear and fast-moving, with no obvious signs of contamination. But looked clean and safe to drink weren't the same thing, especially this far into the backcountry. Giardia, Cryptosporidium, half a dozen other microscopic nasties could be swimming in that seemingly pristine flow. I had one purification tablet left, but what if this wasn't the only water I'd find? What if I needed to save it? My throat felt like sandpaper, and the sound of the creek was becoming a torment. I pulled out my water bottle and knelt by the stream's edge. The water was shockingly cold against my lips. I drank carefully at first, then more greedily as my body's thirst overrode my caution. It tasted of minerals and stone, wild and clean in a way that made me understand how artificial every other drink had ever been. I filled my bottle, dropped in the purification tablet, and tried not to think about all the things it wouldn't protect me from. With my immediate thirst addressed, I allowed myself to survey my surroundings more carefully. The creek had carved itself a small canyon through the landscape, maybe 20 feet across at its widest point. On the far bank, clusters of small dark berries hung from low shrubs I thought I recognized. My stomach, empty except for the creek water now sloshing around inside it, gave an audible rumble. The berries looked like something I'd seen in a field guide once. Small, dark blue, growing in tight clusters on woody stems. Native currants maybe? Or some kind of elderberry. My knowledge of edible wild plants was theoretical at best, gleaned from books and websites rather than experience. But the berries looked plump and fresh, and several showed signs of having been eaten by birds. That was supposed to be a good sign. I waded across the creek, the current tugging at my boots with surprising strength for such a small waterway. The first berry was tart and astringent, puckering my mouth. But it was food, or at least my body was willing to accept it as such. I picked carefully, taking only a few berries from each cluster, some half-remembered advice about sustainable foraging flickering in my mind. As I picked berries and filled my water bottle, I found myself thinking about the last time I'd been here with my father. Not this exact spot, but this same high country where he'd taught me to read the landscape. It was maybe 5 years ago, one of our last trips together before his arthritis made the steep climbs too difficult. The thing about this country, he'd said, sitting on a rock beside a different creek in a different valley, is that it'll give you everything you need if you know how to ask nicely, but it won't suffer fools. At the time, I'd thought I understood what he meant. Now, with my throat raw from untreated water and my stomach cramping from questionable berries, I was beginning to grasp the deeper truth. The country didn't care about my hiking experience, or my expensive gear, or my confidence. It would test me without mercy, and whether I passed or failed depended on how well I'd learned its lessons. The sun was already low enough to be casting long shadows by the time I began looking for a place to spend the night. Following the creek downstream seemed like the obvious choice. Water always led somewhere, and in populated country like the Blue Mountains, that somewhere was usually civilization. But darkness came quickly in the mountains, and I'd learned enough hard lessons for one day. I found a small flat area a few yards back from the creek bank, partially sheltered by a large boulder and a stand of young eucalyptus. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. I'd never built a shelter that wasn't part of an organized course or a planned camping trip. The reality was more difficult and less romantic than I'd imagined. Using my hiking poles as a frame and my emergency bivvy as a tarp, I managed to construct something that might keep me dry if it rained. The structure looked precarious and felt worse, but it was better than sleeping completely in the open. I'd watched my father build proper shelters from natural materials, but I'd never paid close enough attention to the details, another lesson I was learning too late. As I worked, I kept thinking about Sarah's words from that morning. Maybe it's time to start hiking with other people. She'd been frustrated with my solo trips, worried about exactly this kind of situation. I'd brushed off her concerns, confident in my abilities, certain that I knew what I was doing. Now I understood that my solo trips had been as much about proving something to myself as about enjoying the bush. My father had hiked alone sometimes, but he'd earned that privilege through decades of experience and careful preparation. I'd been mimicking his confidence without possessing his knowledge. The difference was becoming painfully clear. As full darkness settled over the mountains, I lay in my makeshift shelter and listened to the night sounds of the high country. The creek provided a constant backdrop of white noise, but over and under it came other sounds: the rustle of small creatures moving through the undergrowth, the crack of cooling wood. Stranger noises I couldn't identify. Something large moved through the brush nearby, heavy footsteps that paused, then moved on. My rational mind supplied explanations. A wombat maybe, or a wild pig rooting for food. But in the darkness, every sound seemed charged with menace. My father had always said the night belonged to different creatures than the day. Lying alone in the bush, I began to understand what he'd meant. The stomach cramps started around midnight. At first I blamed them on hunger, but as they intensified into sharp, twisting knots of pain, I realized the berries or the creek water, or both, were exacting their price. I spent the dark hours alternating between bouts of nausea and desperate trips into the bushes, my body rejecting my attempts at wilderness self-sufficiency. By dawn I was hollow and shaking, my confidence in my outdoor skills thoroughly shattered. The experienced hiker who'd set out 3 days earlier had been replaced by someone who couldn't tell safe food from poison or build a shelter that didn't collapse twice during the night. I lay in the wreckage of my bivvy as pale morning light filtered through the trees and wondered if this was how people died in the wilderness. Not from dramatic accidents or sudden disasters, but from a series of small, stupid mistakes that compounded until there was no way back. The creek still murmured its promises nearby, but now the sound seemed less like salvation and more like a lure leading me deeper into country that didn't care whether I lived or died. I woke to sunlight that felt like knives behind my eyelids. My mouth was a desert of cracked leather, and when I tried to sit up, the world tilted sideways in a nauseating spin that left me retching bile into the dirt. The third day had arrived with a vengeance. My water bottle lay empty beside me. I'd finished the last drops sometime during my fevered night, though I couldn't remember drinking them. The creek beckoned from a few meters away, but the memory of last night's stomach cramps made me hesitate. Still, dehydration would kill me faster than whatever parasites might be swimming in that mountain water. I crawled to the bank on hands and knees, no longer caring about dignity or proper water purification techniques. The first handful of creek water hit my system like a shock. My stomach cramped immediately, but I forced myself to drink more, cupping the cold liquid to my mouth again and again until my immediate thirst was slaked. Then, I sat back on my heels and waited to see whether my body would accept this offering, or reject it, as violently as it had the berries. The world around me seemed too bright, too sharp. The colors bled at the edges like watercolors in rain. The sound of the creek was amplifying and fading in waves, sometimes a whisper, sometimes a roar that seemed to come from inside my skull. I tried to stand and immediately sat back down as my legs refused to support me properly. Follow the water downstream, I told myself, clinging to this simple survival rule as if it were a lifeline. Water always leads somewhere. People build near water. Follow it and find help. But when I tried to gather my scattered gear, my hands shook so badly I could barely stuff my sleeping bag into its compression sack. I left the collapsed remains of my shelter behind and began walking downstream, using my hiking poles more for balance than support. The creek wound through stands of mountain ash and patches of dense undergrowth that caught at my pack and scratched my arms. Several times I lost sight of the water entirely and had to backtrack, my sense of direction failing me completely. The hallucinations started subtly. At first it was just movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that resolved into nothing when I turned my head. Then I began hearing voices in the sound of the water, conversations I couldn't quite make out but felt certain were important. My father's voice seemed to drift from somewhere ahead, calling my name, but when I tried to follow the sound, I found only more empty bush. By what felt like midday, though the sun's position made no sense to me anymore, I was stopping every few minutes to rest against trees. My legs felt disconnected from my body, wooden and unresponsive. The creek had widened slightly and was running clearer, which some rational part of my mind registered as a good sign. But that rational voice was being steadily overwhelmed by a growing panic that felt like insects crawling under my skin. I drank again from the creek, forcing myself to take small sips despite my body's desperate craving for more. This time I managed to keep the water down, though my stomach continued to cramp in protest. As I knelt by the water's edge, I caught sight of my reflection and barely recognized the haggard face staring back at me. 3 days in the bush had carved hollows under my cheekbones and given my eyes a wild, desperate look that reminded me of something feral. This is how people die out here, the thought came unbidden. Not from bears or snakes or dramatic cliff falls. They die from making one wrong turn and then getting weaker and more confused until they can't think their way out of a paper bag. The afternoon brought worse delirium. I found myself having full conversations with my father, who walked just ahead of me through the trees, always staying just out of clear sight. Sometimes the old man was encouraging, reminding me of survival techniques we'd practiced together. Other times his voice turned harsh, disappointed, asking why I'd been so careless, so arrogant, so certain I could handle the high country alone. "I taught you better than this," my father's voice said, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere. "You think you know this country, but you don't know anything. You're just another city boy playing at being bushwise." "I'm trying," I said aloud, my voice cracked and strange in the empty forest. "I'm doing everything you taught me." But the truth was I'd forgotten half of what he'd shown me, and the other half seemed useless now that I was actually fighting for my life. All those weekend camping trips and bushwalking courses had been games compared to this, adventures with safety nets, where rescue was always just a phone call away. I remembered one particular trip when I was maybe 16. We'd gotten caught in an unexpected storm up near Mount Banks, proper mountain weather that turned the world into a confusion of mist and driving rain. I'd been scared, wanting to head back to the car, but my father had been calm, patient. "This is when you learn who you really are," he'd said, helping me set up our tarp properly, showing me how to read the wind patterns to choose the best spot. When everything goes wrong, when the country tests you, that's when you find out what you're made of. At the time I'd felt proud when we weathered the storm successfully. I'd thought it meant I was becoming a real bushman, someone who could handle whatever the mountains threw at me. Now I understood that my father had been protecting me even then, using his knowledge to keep me safe while letting me think I was proving myself. The creek led me through country that grew wilder and more confusing. Rocky outcrops forced me to climb up and around, sometimes losing the water's sound entirely before finding it again in unexpected places. My map was useless. I'd lost track of my position completely, and the topographic lines swam before my eyes like abstract art. The GPS unit in my pack might as well have been a paperweight. As the day wore on, my world contracted to the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other. The forest around me took on a dreamlike quality, familiar and alien at the same time. Trees seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. Rocks arranged themselves into faces that watched my stumbling progress with ancient, indifferent eyes. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to slant through the canopy at a sharper angle, I stopped beside a pool where the creek widened and deepened. My reflection in the still water looked like a ghost, pale, hollow-cheeked, eyes too large in a face that had lost all its padding. For a moment I couldn't remember my own name, couldn't remember why I was here or where I was trying to go. The sound of my own harsh breathing brought me back to myself with a jolt. I was dying out here. Not dramatically, not heroically, just fading away like smoke in the wilderness that had swallowed up my mistakes and my overconfidence. In a day or two, some other hiker might find my bones beside this pool, if they found me at all. I cupped water to my mouth and drank again, no longer caring about the consequences. The creek water was all that stood between me and complete dehydration now. I had to keep moving, had to follow the water downstream and hope it led somewhere before my strength gave out entirely, but even as I forced myself to stand and keep walking, I could feel my body beginning to shut down. The Aboriginal man appeared like a figure emerging from a dream. I was struggling through a particularly thick patch of undergrowth, following what might have been an animal track parallel to the creek, when I looked up and saw the old man sitting on a fallen log as if he'd been waiting there for hours. Tommy, though he hadn't given his name yet, was perhaps 60, with graying hair and skin weathered to the color of old leather. He wore faded jeans and a flannel shirt that had seen better decades, and his dark eyes held a depth that made me feel like I was being measured and found wanting. Most unsettling was how silently he'd appeared. There were no broken branches or disturbed leaves to mark his passage through the thick bush. "You're a long way from the main track," Tommy said, his voice carrying easily over the sound of the creek despite its quiet tone. I stumbled to a halt, swaying slightly on my feet. For a moment I wondered if this was another hallucination. The old man seemed to shimmer slightly at the edges, like heat haze rising from summer asphalt. But his voice was solid and real, the first human sound I'd heard in days. "I'm lost," I said, the words coming out as a croak. "Been lost for 3 days? My water ran out, GPS is useless under the canopy. I've been following the creek downstream." Tommy nodded slowly, as if this was exactly what he'd expected to hear. "Creek don't always lead where you think they will, son. This one here, she goes deep into the country before she finds her way back to people. Could follow her for weeks and still be walking in circles." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd been counting on the creek to save me, following it with the desperate faith of a drowning man clinging to driftwood. If Tommy was right, I'd been walking myself deeper into trouble rather than toward rescue. "Then, how do I get out?" I asked, hearing the desperation in my own voice. "I don't even know which direction the main trail is anymore." Tommy stood up from the log with fluid grace that belied his apparent age. "Country tells you everything you need to know, if you know how to listen. Your people, though, you've forgotten how to read the signs. Too busy looking at maps and little machines to see what's right in front of you." He gestured toward a rocky ridge visible through the trees to our left. "See that ridge line there? Way the rocks are stacked, that's old sea bottom pushed up millions of years ago. Runs north-south, and she's got a saddle about 2 kilometers along that'll take you over to Thompson Creek." Thompson Creek, now that's a different story. She runs straight down to the ranger station at Wentworth Falls. I squinted in the direction Tommy was pointing, but all I could see was more endless bush. The rock formations Tommy mentioned were invisible to me, just part of the green chaos that had been confusing me for days. "I don't see it," I admitted. "It all looks the same to me." "That's your problem right there." Tommy moved to stand beside me, and up close the old man smelled of wood smoke and something else. Eucalyptus maybe, or native herbs. "You're looking but you're not seeing. Listen." We stood in silence for a moment. I could hear the creek, the rustle of leaves in a breeze I couldn't feel, the distant call of what might have been a kookaburra. But if there were messages hidden in these sounds, they were written in a language I'd never learned. "Hear that bird there? That's a lyrebird, and he's telling you about water. Not the creek you've been following. Different water, fresher, running over granite instead of limestone. He's calling from maybe half a kilometer that way." Tommy pointed in a direction that meant nothing to me. "And that sound underneath, like wind but not quite? That's Thompson Creek running through the gorge. She's maybe 2 hours walk if you know the way." I strained my ears but couldn't separate the sounds Tommy was describing from the general noise of the bush. My dehydration and exhaustion were making it hard to focus, and I was beginning to wonder again if this encounter was real or just another fever dream. "Are you?" I started to ask if Tommy was real, then stopped. Real or not, this was the first hope I'd had in days. "Can you show me the way?" Tommy shook his head. "This is something you need to do yourself, son. but I can tell you what to look for." He pointed again toward the ridge. "Follow that rocky spine until you find the saddle. You'll know it when you see it. Looks like a giant took a bite out of the ridgeline. Cross over there and head downhill, but not straight down. Angle toward where the sun sets in summer, not winter. Summer sun will take you to Thompson Creek." The distinction between summer and winter sun positions was lost on me entirely, but I nodded anyway, afraid that if I admitted my ignorance, Tommy might disappear back into the bush. "Look for the old scars on the trees," Tommy continued. "My grandfather's grandfather marked the way through here, carved signs that'll last longer than your maps and machines. Most people walk right past them, but they're there if you know how to look. And follow the honeybees, they know where the clean water runs." I wanted to ask what kind of scars to look for, how to tell honeybees from other insects, how to judge the angle of the summer sun when I could barely tell which direction was which. But when I looked up from pulling my water bottle from my pack, Tommy was gone. Not walked away, not disappeared behind a tree, simply absent, as if he'd never been there at all. I spun around, searching the surrounding bush, but found no trace of the old man. No broken twigs, no footprints, no lingering scent of wood smoke. Only the endless green maze that had been swallowing my voice and my hope for 3 days. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the rocks. "Tommy, are you there?" Silence, except for the creek, and the wind in the trees, and that distant bird call that might or might not have been a lyrebird with a message about water. I stood alone in the bush, swaying slightly on my feet, and wondered if dehydration had finally pushed me over the edge into complete hallucination. But real or imagined, Tommy's advice was the only guidance I had. The ridge line was real enough. I could see it clearly now that my attention had been drawn to it. And there did seem to be a low point along its length that might be the saddle Tommy had mentioned. Abandoning the creek felt like cutting my last lifeline, but I gathered what remained of my strength and began climbing toward the rocky spine. I searched for old scars on trees and hoped that somewhere ahead lay Thompson Creek and the promise of rescue. The climb toward the ridge took me through country that seemed older and wilder than anything I'd encountered so far. The trees here were massive mountain ashes, their trunks scarred by old fires and marked with what might have been deliberate cuts. Whether these were the aboriginal signs Tommy had mentioned or just natural damage, I couldn't tell. Everything looked significant and meaningless at the same time. My strength was failing steadily. Several times I had to stop and rest against trees, fighting waves of dizziness that made the forest spin around me. My water bottle was empty again, and without the creek nearby I had no way to refill it. The afternoon sun felt brutal on my exposed skin, and I was beginning to understand why so many people died of exposure in country that looked so green and abundant. As I climbed, I found myself thinking about all the conversations I'd had with my father about reading the bush. He'd tried to teach me so many things: how to identify edible plants, how to find water, how to navigate by the sun and stars. But I'd been young and impatient, more interested in the adventure than the knowledge. I'd thought the skills would come naturally when I needed them. Now I needed them desperately, and my mind was a blank. I could remember fragments, something about moss growing on the south side of trees, something about following ridgelines to find water. But the details were gone, lost in years of taking my father's knowledge for granted. The saddle, when I finally reached it, was unmistakable, a deep notch in the ridgeline that looked exactly like Tommy's description of a giant's bite mark. I paused there, looking back at the country I'd struggled through, then forward into the valley beyond. Somewhere down there, if Tommy was right, Thompson Creek was running toward civilization and rescue. But as I began my descent into the new valley, I heard something that made my blood freeze, the distant rumble of thunder, though the sky above was still clear blue. The sound was growing louder, and it wasn't coming from above. It was coming from upstream, from the direction of the creek I'd been following for the past day and a half. Flash flood. I'd heard enough wilderness safety lectures to recognize the signs, even in my exhausted state. Somewhere upstream, probably in the higher peaks where I couldn't see, a storm was dumping water into the catchment. All that water was now racing downhill, and I was directly in its path. I abandoned any attempt at a controlled descent and began half running, half falling down the slope toward what I hoped was higher ground on the far side of the valley. Behind me, the rumble was growing louder, punctuated now by the crack and crash of trees being torn from their roots. The peaceful creek that had been my lifeline and tormentor for the past day was transforming into something monstrous. I made it perhaps halfway down the slope before the wall of water came into view. A brown, churning mass, carrying logs and debris, rising far above the normal creek banks and tearing through the forest like a living thing. My makeshift campsite from the night before was somewhere under that destruction, along with any hope of backtracking to find a known route. The flood surge passed in less than 10 minutes, but it left behind a landscape transformed. Where there had been a gentle creek running through green forest, now there was a wide scar of mud and uprooted trees. It looked like some giant plow had torn through the valley. The sound of running water had changed too, deeper now, more urgent, carrying the promise of more destruction downstream. I stood on the muddy slope, soaked by spray from the flood and shaking with exhaustion and shock. My situation had just become much worse. Not only was I still lost, but now my only landmark, the creek, had been transformed into something unrecognizable. The flood had wiped away any possibility of retracing my steps or finding the route I'd been following. But as I stood there in despair, something caught my eye on the far ridge. A thin vertical line that didn't belong to the natural landscape. It took me several seconds to recognize it for what it was. A fire tower, one of the old wooden structures that rangers once used to watch for bushfires. The tower was kilometers away across the devastated valley, perched on what looked like an almost impossibly steep ridge. Getting there would mean crossing the flood zone, climbing through dense bush, and descending what appeared to be nearly vertical terrain. In my current condition, it might as well have been on the moon, but it was the first man-made structure I'd seen since leaving the main trail 4 days ago. Where there were fire towers, there were usually access roads, or at least maintained walking tracks. If I could reach it, I might find a way back to civilization, or at the very least, a radio or telephone to call for help. I adjusted my pack straps and began picking my way down toward the flood zone. I tried not to think about how little strength I had left, or how many things could go wrong in the climb ahead. The fire tower wavered in my vision like a mirage, but it was real, and it was there. Right now it represented my only hope of getting out of the high country alive. The climb began easily enough through the flood debris, picking between fallen logs and avoiding the deeper pools of muddy water that had collected in the low spots. But as I left the devastated valley floor and began ascending the ridge proper, the gradient steepened dramatically. What had looked like a manageable slope from a distance revealed itself as a series of near-vertical rock faces interrupted by narrow ledges choked with scrub. Within the first hour, my legs were trembling. My vision kept swimming, forcing me to stop every few minutes to grip a tree trunk or rock outcrop until the world steadied itself. The berries and creek water had kept me alive, but they hadn't given me the calories I needed for this kind of exertion. Each step upward felt like lifting weights with muscles made of sand. Halfway up the ridge, clinging to a narrow ledge while trying to find my next handhold, my mind began to wander. The rock face in front of me blurred and shifted, becoming the weathered bark of a different tree on a different mountain. I was 12 years old again, following my father up Mount Kalong on our first serious bushwalk together. My dad had been patient then, stopping whenever I needed to catch my breath. He'd pointed out bird calls and explained how to read the country. "The land will tell you everything you need to know," he'd said, crouched beside a fallen log to show me the tiny scratches that meant wombats passed this way regularly. "You just have to learn the language." I blinked hard, forcing myself back to the present. The memory felt so vivid I could almost smell his pipe tobacco on the wind. But my father was 6 months dead now, buried in the Lutheran cemetery outside Bathurst while I was overseas for work, too caught up in meetings and deadlines to come home in time. The guilt of that absence had been part of what drove me to attempt this solo hike in the first place. Some half-formed idea that walking the same ridges we'd explored together might bring me peace. Instead, it was killing me. "Come on, Jack," I whispered to myself, the words barely audible over my ragged breathing. The old man didn't raise a quitter. I found another handhold, pulled myself up another few feet. The fire tower seemed no closer than when I'd started climbing, still wavering like a heat mirage on the ridge above. But there was nowhere else to go now. The flood had cut off retreat, and the alternative to climbing was dying slowly beside the destroyed creek. The sun reached its peak and began its afternoon descent while I inched my way up the ridge. My water bottle, refilled from a small seep I'd found among the rocks, was nearly empty again. The handful of berries I'd managed to gather along the way sat uneasily in my stomach, adding to the nausea that came in waves whenever I looked down at the drop below. It was during one of these dizzy spells that the voice came back to me, clear as if Tommy was standing right beside me on the narrow ledge. "Country's got its own rhythm, mate. You been fighting it when you should be dancing with it." My head snapped up, scanning the rock face above for any sign of the old man. But there was nothing except granite and scrub, and the distant cry of a wedgie circling overhead. Still, the words seemed to unlock something in my understanding. I'd been attacking the climb like a problem to be solved through brute force, when what I needed was patience and observation. Looking more carefully at the rock face, I began to see the subtle lines and cracks that suggested a different route. Less direct but more manageable, following natural weaknesses in the stone rather than trying to force my way straight up. My father had taught me this principle years ago. The path of least resistance was usually the wisest choice in difficult country. The new route took me on a diagonal traverse across the ridge face, adding distance but reducing the crushing steepness. My progress improved, though my energy reserves continued to drain away like water from a cracked tank. Every few hundred meters I had to stop and rest, pressing my back against the rock while my vision cleared and my heart rate slowed. During one of these breaks, as the afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the valley below, I found myself thinking about the last conversation I'd had with my father. It had been a brief phone call 3 days before the stroke, me calling from a hotel in Singapore, him at home watching the cricket. We talked about nothing much: the weather, my travels, plans for Christmas that would never happen. "You should come home more often," he'd said near the end of the call. "Country's still here waiting for you." At the time, I'd interpreted it as gentle pressure to visit, maybe guilt about leaving the old man alone in the house where I'd grown up. Now, suspended on a cliff face with my strength failing and darkness approaching, I wondered if he'd meant something deeper. The country was waiting, not just the physical landscape, but some essential understanding that could only be gained by being truly present in it, vulnerable to it. The fire tower was close now, perhaps another 100 meters of vertical climbing, but those 100 meters might as well have been 1,000. My hands were cramping, my legs shaking uncontrollably whenever I tried to support my weight. The sun was getting lower, and I knew that attempting this climb in darkness would be suicide. I found a wider ledge, barely large enough to sit on, and forced myself to eat the last of my berries and drink the remaining mouthful of water. The liquid was warm and tasted of granite, but it was precious as gold. As I sat there in the growing dusk, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, I felt a strange sense of acceptance wash over me. I might not make it. After all the struggle and fear and desperate hope, I might die here on this ledge. Another casualty of the high country's indifference to human ambition. But somehow, the prospect didn't terrify me as much as it should have. There was something fitting about it, something my father would have understood about becoming part of the landscape that had shaped them both. But with the acceptance came a different kind of strength, not the fierce determination of the past few days, but something quieter and more sustainable. I closed my eyes and listened to the night sounds of the ridge, the distant call of a powerful owl, the rustle of wind through the banksia scrub above, the faint trickle of water somewhere in the rocks below. The sounds seemed to form a pattern, a rhythm that matched my breathing and heartbeat. When I opened my eyes again, the moon had risen, casting everything in silver light. The final pitch to the fire tower was clearly visible now, and I could see that what had looked impossible from below was actually quite manageable. A series of natural steps in the rock, worn smooth by decades of weather but perfectly positioned for climbing. I stood up, shouldered my pack and began the final ascent. The fire tower loomed above me in the moonlight, a skeletal structure of weathered timber that creaked and swayed in the mountain wind. I hauled myself over the edge of the platform and collapsed, too exhausted to feel triumph or relief. I simply lay there for long minutes, breathing hard, and listening to the tower's wooden bones settle around me. When I finally found the strength to sit up, the view took what remained of my breath away. The entire high country spread out below me in silver and shadow, ridge after ridge, rolling away to the horizon like frozen waves. I could see the scar of the flash flood cutting through the valley where I'd nearly died, and beyond it, the gentler slopes where I'd first left the main trail. From up here, the landscape made sense in a way it never had from ground level. I could trace the logic of water and stone, see how the country fitted together in patterns too large to comprehend from inside them. The tower itself was clearly abandoned, probably hadn't been manned for years. Wooden shutters hung askew around what had once been a cabin, and the metal stairs leading up to the observation platform were red with rust. But it was solid enough, and it was shelter. After 4 days in the bush, it felt like luxury. I pushed through the partly open door and found myself in a small room that had once housed the firewatching equipment. Most of it was gone now, just empty brackets on the walls where radios and telephones had been mounted, and a few pieces of obsolete gear covered in dust and spiderwebs. In one corner stood an old radio set, its metal case green with corrosion. I tried the radio first, knowing it was futile but unable to help myself. The power switch clicked uselessly. No batteries, and probably no functioning circuits even if there had been. The telephone line had been cut, leaving just a stub of cable poking through the wall. But on the small table beside the radio, I found something more valuable than any electronic equipment. A logbook, its leather cover cracked with age but still intact. I opened it carefully, afraid the pages might crumble at my touch. The early entries dated back decades. Brief notes from firewatchers recording weather conditions, wildlife sightings, the occasional bushfire spotted and reported. But the more recent entries, from the past few years, told different stories. These were written by people like myself, lost hikers who'd managed to reach the tower, searching for a way back to civilization. I read through them by moonlight streaming through the open door, finding a strange comfort in the familiar litany of desperation and hope. Here was a family from Canberra who'd taken a wrong turn near Mount Cloudmaker and spent 2 days without water before spotting the tower. There was a solo walker who'd fallen and injured his ankle, holing up in the tower for 3 days before attempting the trek out. Each entry included details about routes attempted, landmarks spotted, advice for the next person who might need it. But it was the most recent entry that made my pulse quicken. The handwriting was shaky, the words sometimes trailing off as if the writer had been fighting exhaustion, but the date was clear, just 6 weeks ago. Day 5 lost. Found tower after flood washed out camp. Radio dead like the others said. Can see a track from the platform, northeast side, follows the ridge line down toward what looks like a road. Spotted vehicles moving there yesterday. Going to try it tomorrow. If anyone finds this and the track doesn't work, there's a creek on the south side of the ridge that might lead to the Jenolan Road. Water's good there, don't give up. The entry was signed with just initials. MK. I moved to the windows facing northeast, peering out into the moonlit landscape. At first, I could see nothing but the usual tangle of ridges and valleys. But as my eyes adjusted, and I studied the terrain more carefully, I began to make out what MK had seen, a thin line cutting across the face of the distant slope. Too straight and regular to be natural, it was barely visible even from this height, probably invisible from ground level, but it was definitely there. A walking track. Overgrown, and probably unmaintained, but following the purposeful line that marked human passage through the wilderness. I spent the rest of the night in the tower, alternating between restless attempts to sleep and careful study of the country spread out below me. As dawn broke, the Bataka Bekteru track became clearer, and I could even make out what might have been a road or cleared area in the distance where the track seemed to terminate. It was perhaps 10 kilometers away, a full day's walk in good conditions, but manageable if I could find the start of the track. The morning light also revealed other features that had been hidden in darkness. The creek MK had mentioned was clearly visible on the south side of the ridge, and I could trace its path as it wound down through gentler country, toward what were almost certainly agricultural lands. There were even a few structures visible in that direction, distant rooftops that spoke of farms and civilization. For the first time since leaving the main trail, I felt something like confidence. I had options now, real choices based on information rather than blind hope. The track looked like the faster route if I could find it, but the creek offered a more certain path to safety, even if it took longer. I opened the logbook to a fresh page and wrote my own entry, recording what I could see from the tower and adding what little I'd learned during my ordeal in the high country. Future lost souls might need every scrap of information they could get. As I wrote, I found myself thinking about Tommy and the cryptic advice about reading the country. Whether the old man had been real or a product of my fevered imagination, the wisdom had been sound. The land did tell stories to those who learned its language. I closed the logbook, shouldered my pack, and prepared to begin the descent. The northeast ridge beckoned, promising a track that might lead me home. The track was even harder to find than I'd expected. What had looked like a clear line from the tower's platform dissolved into shadow and uncertainty when viewed from ground level. I spent most of the morning working my way along the ridge, stopping frequently to climb trees or scramble up rocky outcrops for a better view. I was trying to pick up the thread of human passage through the bush. It was nearly noon when I finally found it, not the track itself, but signs of its existence. A few cut branches that were too clean to be natural damage, scuff marks on a fallen log that suggested regular passage. Most tellingly, a small cairn of stacked stones, tucked beside a large boulder, the kind of informal marker that bushwalkers use to mark difficult-to-follow routes. From there, the track revealed itself gradually. It was old and overgrown, probably originally cut by forestry workers or surveyors decades ago, and maintained since then only by the occasional hiker. In places it disappeared entirely, forcing me to cast about for the next section like a hunter following a cold trail. But it was definitely there, and it was definitely heading in the right direction. The walking was easier than the hellish climb up to the fire tower, but my reserves were nearly exhausted. I moved slowly, stopping frequently to rest, and to nibble at the small supply of berries I'd managed to gather along the way. The track followed the ridgeline for several kilometers before beginning a gradual descent toward the lower country, and with each step downward, I felt my hopes rising. By late afternoon, the track had become more distinct, and I began to see encouraging signs of recent human activity. Fresh boot prints in a muddy section. A discarded energy bar wrapper caught in the bushes. Most encouraging of all, the sound of vehicles in the distance, still faint, but unmistakably the hum of traffic on a sealed road. The sun was setting when I rounded a bend in the track and saw the most beautiful sight of my life. A small wooden building with a green Parks Department sign beside it, and beyond that, a gravel road with a white utility vehicle parked beside it. The ranger station was exactly where MK had predicted it would be. I stumbled the last 100 meters on legs that felt like water, calling out as I approached the building. The door opened before I reached it, and a middle-aged woman in ranger uniform stepped out. Her expression shifted from surprise to professional concern as she took in my condition. "I need help," I managed, my voice barely more than a croak. "Been lost for 5 days." The ranger was already reaching for the radio clipped to her belt. "Don't worry, mate," she said, guiding me toward a chair on the station's small veranda. "You're safe now. Let's get you some water and call this in." As I sank into the chair and accepted the bottle of clean cold water she pressed into my hands, I felt something break loose inside my chest. Relief so profound it was almost painful. I was alive. I was found. The high country had tested me and nearly broken me, but in the end it had let me go. The ranger was speaking into her radio, calling for medical assistance and giving my location, but I barely heard the words. I was looking back up the ridge toward where I knew the fire tower stood, invisible now in the gathering darkness. Somewhere up there, Tommy's voice seemed to whisper on the evening wind, carrying words about the stories the country told and the patience required to hear them. I raised the water bottle in a small salute toward the hidden peaks, then drained it in grateful gulps. I had learned the language, at least enough of it to find my way home. Whether that was enough would depend on what I chose to do with the knowledge. 3 weeks later I stood at the edge of the same trailhead where my ordeal had begun, but this time I wasn't alone. The ranger who had found me, Sarah, I'd learned her name was, had offered to drive me back to the area when I'd called asking about how to find Tommy. She'd been patient with my halting explanation about wanting to thank someone who had helped me, though I could see the concern in her eyes when I described the encounter. "Look, Jack," she'd said over the phone, "I've been working these mountains for 12 years. I know most of the traditional owners who still come through regularly, and the old-timers who've been living rough up there. The name Tommy doesn't ring any bells, but that doesn't mean anything. Could be a nickname, could be someone passing through, but I'll take you up to Rocky Creek Station. That's the closest settlement to where you were wandering. If anyone knows your bloke, it'll be the folks there." The drive up the winding mountain road had stirred memories I wasn't sure I was ready to confront. Every bend brought back fragments of those 5 days, the taste of creek water, the sound of my own labored breathing, the weight of despair that had settled on my shoulders like a pack full of stones. But stronger than the fear was the need to find Tommy, to verify that the encounter had been real, to thank the old man who had appeared when I needed guidance most. Rocky Creek Station turned out to be barely worthy of the name, a cluster of weathered buildings around a general store, a pub that looked like it hadn't been renovated since the 1960s, and a few houses scattered along a dirt road that petered out into bushland. Sarah parked near the store and we went inside, where a woman with sun-weathered hands was stacking tins of soup behind the counter. "Morning, Val," Sarah said. "This is Jack. He's looking for someone who helped him when he was lost up on the ridge last month. Aboriginal bloke, older fellow, goes by Tommy. You know anyone like that in the area?" Val looked up from her soup tins, studying me with the frank appraisal of someone who had spent decades sizing up strangers who wandered into her remote corner of the world. "Lost up there, were you? Heard about that on the radio. 5 days, wasn't it?" I nodded. "Tommy found me when I was in pretty bad shape. Gave me advice about following the creek, reading the country. Without him, I don't think I would have made it to the fire tower." "Tommy," Val repeated, frowning. "Can't say I know any Tommy. What did he look like?" I tried to summon the details, but realized how hazy my memory of that encounter had become. Older man, maybe 70s. Thin but strong-looking. He knew the country like he'd been born to it. Appeared out of nowhere near Copper Creek, then disappeared just as quick. Val shook her head. "Sorry, love, doesn't sound familiar, but hang on," she called toward the back of the store. "Pete, come out here a minute." A man emerged from what looked like a storeroom, wiping his hands on a rag. He had the deep tan and permanent squint of someone who spent his days outdoors, and when Val explained what we were looking for, he listened with the careful attention I'd seen in other people who made their living in the bush. "Tommy, you said." Pete scratched his chin. "Aboriginal bloke, knows the high country." "That's right," I said, hope rising. "Do you know him?" "Well, there was a Tommy in Gurang, who used to come through here regular like, maybe 10-15 years back. Old traditional owner, knew every rock and tree from here to the escarpment. But he passed away, must be 8 years ago now. Had a proper ceremony for him and everything. Lot of people came from all over to pay their respects." I felt something cold settle in my stomach. "Are you sure? This Tommy I met, he was definitely alive. We talked for maybe an hour." Pete and Val exchanged a look. "Could be someone else," Pete said carefully. "Tommy's not exactly an uncommon name. But the thing is, most of the traditional blokes who still come through here, I know them. My family's been in these mountains for 4 generations, and we've always had good relationships with the original people. If there was someone working that country regular like, I reckon I'd have met him." We spent another hour making inquiries. Sarah drove us to the pub, where a handful of locals were nursing midday beers and proved equally mystified by my description. An old-timer named Charlie, who claimed to have lived in the mountains for 60 years, listened to the story with growing interest, but could offer no identification. "Sounds like someone who knows the old ways," Charlie said finally, "but I can't place him. You sure you got the name right?" I was beginning to doubt everything. The encounter, which had felt so vivid and crucial at the time, now seemed to shimmer at the edges like a mirage. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was Tommy just a fever dream conjured by a desperate mind? We tried the local police station, a one-room office in the back of the community center, but the constable who covered the area had never heard of anyone matching Tommy's description. He was sympathetic but practical. "Look mate, no offense, but you were in pretty rough shape when you came out of there. Dehydration, possible food poisoning, 5 days of stress. The mind can play tricks under those conditions. Maybe this Tommy was someone passing through, someone you met, but your memories filled in details that weren't quite right." The drive back down the mountain was quiet. Sarah seemed lost in thought, while I stared out at the country that had nearly killed me, trying to reconcile what I remembered with what I was being told. As we reached the lower elevations where the eucalyptus gave way to cleared farmland, Sarah finally spoke. "I've seen it before, you know," she said. "People who've had close calls in the bush, they sometimes report encounters that are hard to verify. Doesn't mean they're lying or crazy. Sometimes the country gives you what you need to survive even if it's not what you expect." "So, you think I imagined him?" "I think you survived 5 days in some of the roughest country in the state. And that took more than luck. Whether Tommy was flesh and blood or something else, does it really matter?" I considered this as we drove past farms where cattle grazed in paddocks that looked impossibly green and tame after the austere beauty of the high country. Did it matter? The advice had been real. Follow the water, read the signs, trust the country to tell its story. That guidance had led me to the fire tower, to MK, Metis logbook entry, to the track that brought me to safety, but as the days passed and I returned to my life in the city, I found I couldn't let the question go. I spent hours online, searching for any reference to Aboriginal elders named Tommy, who had connections to the Blue Mountains. I found several, but none who matched my memory of the man who had appeared beside Copper Creek. Some had died years ago, others lived hundreds of kilometers away. The closest match was Tommy Ngarang, the man Pete had mentioned, but the dates were wrong, and the photograph I found in an old newspaper obituary showed a heavier man with different features. Late at night, lying in bed in my apartment with its climate control and filtered water and all the comforts that made survival a distant concern, I would close my eyes and try to summon every detail of that encounter. Tommy's voice, the way he moved through the bush without seeming to disturb anything, the certainty in his words when he spoke about reading the country's signs. The more I examined the memory, the more it seemed to shift and change, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. One evening, nearly 2 months after my rescue, I found myself sitting in my father's old chair, the one piece of furniture I'd kept after settling the estate. His hiking journals were stacked on the side table beside me, and on impulse, I picked up one from 20 years ago and began reading. The entries were methodical, recording trail conditions and weather and wildlife sightings with the precision of someone who understood that details mattered in the bush. But scattered through the practical observations were other notes, moments when my father had recorded encounters with people who had helped him. A farmer who had given directions when he was lost, a fellow hiker who had shared water during a heat wave, an old prospector who had warned him away from unstable ground. One entry, dated 15 years ago, stopped me cold. Day 3 on the Coppermine Trail, got turned around in the morning fog and ended up following a spur ridge that led nowhere. Water running low and starting to worry about making it back to the car before dark. Met an Aboriginal elder near the old mine workings, didn't catch his name, but he knew the country like his own backyard. Showed me how to read the rock formations to find the main track again, wanted to thank him properly, but when I turned around after getting my bearings he was gone. One of those encounters that reminds you how much the country has to teach, if you're humble enough to listen. I read the entry 3 times, my heart hammering. The location was different, but the description, an Aboriginal elder who appeared when help was needed, who knew the country intimately, who vanished as suddenly as he had appeared, was remarkably similar to my own experience. I spent the next weekend going through all my father's journals, looking for other references. I found 2 more, both describing encounters with helpful strangers who seemed to materialize from the bush at crucial moments. Not all were Aboriginal. One was described as a weathered old white bloke with eyes like chips of sky, but all shared certain characteristics. They appeared when my father was lost or in danger, they provided exactly the guidance needed, and they disappeared before they could be properly thanked. My father had never mentioned these encounters in our conversations, had never suggested that the mountains held anything more mysterious than beautiful views and challenging terrain. But here in the journals, recorded in his careful handwriting, was evidence of something I was beginning to understand differently. The following weekend I drove back to the mountains, not to the remote areas where I'd been lost,